Next up is Lisa Campe, practice leader at Woodard and Curran, presenting in person.
Thank you. Oops, I might have to lower this a little. I'm going to be talking today about a study that the company I work for, Woodard and Curran, that we undertook in Massachusetts to understand what levels would exist in soil in the absence of, suspected sources and point sources of impact. This is by now a very familiar conceptual site model of all, not even all, but some of the ways that PFAS can enter the environment. And for this study, we were trying to avoid any kind of point sources from industry with known air emissions or direct discharge to wastewater treatment plants, or where there had been surface runoff or other types of discharges or runoff. And instead, we're focusing exclusively on areas that could have been impacted by either gaseous pollutants being deposited as part of dry deposition, or that got into rain clouds and came down onto the soil as part of wet deposition in rain or snow, as well as particulates that were deposited directly from the atmosphere to soil. And just one thing to keep in mind, what we're seeing in soil is representative of what's happened, over decades. It's cumulative. So even though there might be phase outs of certain contaminants like PFOA and PFAS now and aren't in the rain now, they certainly were for decades and decades. So what we're seeing in the soil is a really good historic record of what's been deposited over time. So the objectives of our study were to try and find undisturbed soils, sort of pristine soils in Massachusetts, and look across the entire state to see what types of PFAS, what concentrations, were there regional differences. The eastern part of the state is much more densely populated and developed than the more rural western part of the state, like in the Berkshires and beyond. And we also wanted to look at how Massachusetts background levels compare to some other states in New England, in particular Vermont and Maine. The New Hampshire data wasn't available at the time, but Jonathan gave a really good talk on that this morning. And also understand the implications for the state soil standards for PFAS, because Massachusetts does regulate 6 PFAS in soil and water at this point. So the first step was to Sam Olney, who is a GIS whiz. We actually first went and tried to identify all open spaces in the state, and that's what all those green areas are. So that's parklands, conservation lands, other undeveloped areas. And then we went and we plotted all types of potential PFAS sources sort of over that layer. So, we looked for things like fire stations, all kinds of landfills. You can see many different kinds of landfills, known hazardous waste sites, either regulated by Massachusetts or RCRA or Superfund, car washes, laundromats. So anything that we had knowledge of as a potential PFAS source, we dotted those. And then we looked at the open space in conjunction with those potential sources to try and find spaces that were distant from all those potential sources. So we were left with many fewer possibilities. And what we had to do is we had to write a research sort of ask to the landowner and to see if they would let us do it. And we did find one that agreed, that luckily had spaces all over the state. However, the deal was it had to be a double-blind study, and I'll get to that in a minute. So we targeted 100 samples as a good size soil data set. And we divided the state into 4 regions that you can see here that align pretty well with the Mass DEP regions for the state. And then we area weighted the number of samples in each one of these regions. And we targeted 4 sample locations per park. So there was 25 parks, 4 samples per park. And for the procedure, some of these areas had hiking trails or dog trails or bike trails. And so we didn't want to sample from the trail area. We actually went off the trail into typically mature woodlands or forests. We scraped off the leaf litter, and then we took samples from the top 6 inches of soil, using all the PFAS protocols. And then, like I said, we collected 4 samples per property, but it had to be double blind because we didn't want the landowner to be in a position that they had to notify DEP that their park was now a site because they exceeded some reportable concentration. So what we did is we identified the geographic area that the sample was collected from, north, northeast, southeast, central, or west, but we didn't specify what the location was or what the park was. So that way, there wouldn't be regulatory implications. And we analyzed each one of those samples for 36 PFAS via isotope dilution, liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry tandem, and then also we looked at total organic carbon. So I have a bunch of slides with the results a few different ways. So of the PFAS we analyzed for, we detected 9 different PFAS. Of the 100 samples, 88 of them, or 88% of the samples, had at least 1 PFAS detected. And of the 25 parks and open spaces we went to, every single one of them had at least 1 sample with PFAS in it. So basically ubiquitous, it was everywhere. And you can see on the histograms in terms of what were the most prevalent, what were we seeing at the highest frequency of detection. PFAS was the winner, and then PFOA, and then lesser amounts of those other PFNA, PFDA, et cetera. And we also made these box and whisker charts. And so the bottom of the box is a 25th percentile. There's a line in the middle for the 50th, and then the 75th, and then the whiskers are 1.5 times the interquartile range. And so these dots above, they sort of look like outliers, but there was a positive skew, just like there is with most environmental data. So in reality, when we did like statistical testing for outliers, I think there was only like 2 in the whole data set in reality. But this just gives you a sense of, again, the range of the concentrations. So then we wanted to look at like, okay, were we seeing different patterns and trends across the state? And so these little pie wheels, each wedge is one of the PFAS that was detected. And the teal color is PFOS, which was at the highest concentration in 3 of the regions. And then in the Southeast region, we had this very elevated single detect sample of PFPEA. But you can see that it also still had plenty of PFOA and PFAS in that region. So this is just a histogram. So in Massachusetts, we regulate 6 PFAS, PFBA, PFDA, PFNA, PFOA, PFAS, and PFHXS. We did not detect any PFHXS in any of the samples. So that's why you only see 5 bars. And so these 2 highest bars in each region, again, this is for prevalence, frequency of detection, are PFAS and PFOA. So that was similar in each region. Then we, looking in particular at PFAS and PFOA, because we had the most robust number of detections for each of them, we did statistical analysis between the regions, and we found that there was no statistically significant difference in what we were finding in PFAS concentrations for PFAS and PFOA across the state. And like I said at the beginning, we also wanted to see how Massachusetts looked compared to Vermont and Maine, which were the 2 other New England states that had data sets available at the time we did this study. So those little rain clouds, by the way, these are the 4 constituents we found in our rain study that we actually also did, that I'm not going to talk about in detail here. But what I wanted to point out is, interestingly, and kind of as we would expect, we didn't have any PFAS and PFOA in the rain samples, and that's because the active manufacturing of those two constituents is phased out. So the rain study is very indicative of sort of a current snapshot of what is being deposited. But since our soil study, the levels aren't really rapidly degrading in the soils, so they're a really good historical record of just what's been emitted, transported, and deposited over time. So of the 5 of the regulated PFAS 6, these are the ones in bold, or the ones that Massachusetts regulates. Maine and Vermont had 4 out of the 5 that were detected, and Massachusetts also detected. And then I thought it was also, we didn't really get into a rigorous statistical comparison for the data sets, but PFAS and PFOA in particular, you can see the concentrations are really pretty similar across all 3 states. So more to come on that. Then we kind of got to the meat of the matter in Massachusetts, which is, are our standards set too low? Are we going to be sort of making the net too big and starting to capture areas and lands that are indicative of background concentrations versus an actual, release to the environment as regulated under the Massachusetts contingency plan? And so we compared to these S1 GW1 standards, and those are soil standards in Massachusetts for residential use, for land that's overlying a potable aquifer. In Massachusetts, the PFAS 6 groundwater standard is 20 parts per trillion summed. It's a very, very stringent standard. So what these standards take into account is the leaching from the soil into the groundwater such that that 20 parts per trillion number won't be exceeded. So what we have here is in red, this first bar is what the standard is for each one of these constituents. The gray is the median, and the blue is the max. In all cases, the maximum concentration we found exceeded that standard, and several of them also the median. And then if you look at it sort of as a percent of concentrations above that S1 GW1 standard, like I said, we didn't have any PFHXS detected. So this is showing just even the reporting limit is above the standard for a lot of the soil samples. But PFOA had the largest number of exceedances. So of those 100 samples, 58% of them had at least one PFAS constituent that exceeded one of these 5 soils or 6 soil standards. And none of the direct contact or incidental ingestion soil numbers were exceeded. Then we went into this thinking, oh, I bet we're going to find a really good correlation between total organic carbon and the levels of PFAS. We thought that the TOC would be a good predictor of PFAS concentrations, but we found that it was not, at least in our study. So the 90th percentile for solids was 82%, and the 90th percentile for total organic carbon in the study was 11%. And that's that red line here plotted. And so our correlation was only 0.2, so was not well correlated. And the coefficient of determination, which is TOC as a variable a good predictor of the PFAS concentrations, it was 0.04. So it was not a good predictor for our study. So maybe new data will show something different. In terms of risk implications, again, what was driving these exceedances of standards was the potential for leaching to the underlying groundwater to be used as a drinking water supply. But the direct contact, incidental ingestion, et cetera, that wasn't a risk. And also the levels we found in soil for PFAS and PFOA were below benchmarks for things like plants and invertebrates, but that doesn't take into account food web, et cetera. So conclusions, PFAS really is almost everywhere. In Massachusetts, our method 1 GW1 standards are pretty much set below observed background. We don't think the concentrations we found really are going to pose a sort of direct contact incidental ingestion risk, but there are uncertainties. And we think these kind of studies are really important to understanding background in the state and the country because of the implications for listing under state regs and EPA as well. So thank you.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions. You can catch up with Lisa